Okay, I'm going to talk about Jewish Curaçao today. So basically, Curaçao, an island in the Caribbean, has this oldest Jewish community in the Western Hemisphere. And they have the oldest synagogue, oldest continually operated synagogue in the West, as well as one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in the West. And they also have some very old Torah scrolls from the Middle Ages. So where is Curacao? Curacao is a small island in the Caribbean. Some people describe it as a big rock. It didn't have very good agriculture, so when the Jewish settlers, as we'll talk about, they turned to trade. So it is controlled currently by the Dutch and is part of the Netherlands Antilles. And the capital is Willemstad, which means town or city of William, the king at the time. And it used to be part of the Spanish crown, but in 1634, the Dutch Empire was expanding and they conquered Curacao from the Spanish. So, as you see, it's the site of wars between the Spanish and the Dutch. They got it in 1634, and the first Jew to land on the island was in 1634. He was Solomon Cohen. He was an interpreter for the Dutch fighting the Spanish. And at this time, the Spanish realm, basically any realm that was Catholic, which would be Spanish and Portuguese, they had the Inquisition. And so Jews and descendants of Jews and descendants of even the Spanish and Iberian crypto Jews, which we'll have to talk about at another time, but essentially a bunch of Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity, their descendants in the late 1500s and early 1600s began moving to the Netherlands, which allowed a Jewish presence and didn't require the same strictness. The Dutch Republic was kind of considered the first instance of religious toleration, and so a very many the different sects, religious groups were allowed to operate in the Netherlands, and one of them was the Jews. The Calvinists or the Reformed were also there, and basically both of these communities, the Calvinists and the Jews, were not allowed to operate in Spanish and Portuguese holdings. But since the Dutch had a different view, they were allowed to operate in Dutch holdings. And so the Dutch were fighting the Spanish and the Portuguese to some extent. And so in 1634, they fought the Spanish and they got Curacao because of that. Also in the same year, the Dutch received Brazil from the Portuguese, but that would only last until 1654. So there was 20 years of Dutch rule in Brazil, but the Dutch rule in Curacao lasted for more than 20 years until the present day. So it's the oldest continuously operated synagogue in the Western Hemisphere, which we'll look at. In Curacao is considered the mother of the Caribbean Jewish communities. It was the most wealthy community. It had the most trade. It was kind of the mothership, the central hub, if you will. So, three examples. The Curacao Jews founded three communities. They helped with the community in New York called Shereth Yisrael, and in the mid 1700s, they provided Shereth Israel with financial support, and according to that, the current congregation of Shearith Israel still has a prayer in their prayer books that commemorates financial support from the Curaçao community hundreds of years later. Curaçao also was instrumental in the creation of the Turo synagogue, or the Turo community in Newport, Rhode Island. In the year 1693, 70 Jews from Curaçao relocated to Newport, Rhode Island, and that became the beginnings of the Turo synagogue, which is a very famous synagogue. Both Shearith Israel and Turo are the oldest American synagogues, and the Curaçao community provided financial support for both of them. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned, the first Jew to land on the island of Curaçao was in 1634 with the Dutch. However, he wasn't the first settler. That was 1651 when the first Jewish settlers under Jean de Ilan came, and he was authorized by the Dutch crown, and so he received patroonship, which basically means he had rights to an estate. So he received an estate and land, and he called the land in the plantation De Hoop, which is the hope in Dutch, De Hoop. And he took 12 settler families with him, and this was the beginnings of the Jewish community in Curaçao. Now, he named the community, the congregation, Mikveh Yisrael, which literally means Hope of Israel. And there was a book that came out in 1650, and it was written by the Dutch rabbi Manasseh ben Israel. And Manasseh ben Israel wrote a book called Mikveh Yisrael, and actually he wrote in Spanish first. It was called Esperanza de Israel, and then it was translated into Latin and Hebrew as Latin Spes Israelis. So Manasseh ben Israel, he talks about this idea that the Jews were scattered in all four corners of the globe, and accordingly, because of that, they were not admitted to England at this time, or they were technically forbidden from being in England, which wasn't exactly true. But in any case, Manasseh ben Israel's book argued that Jews should be readmitted to England by proving that Jews were found everywhere else in the globe, and that the only place they weren't left in was England. And so Manasseh shows that there are Jews in China, India, Ethiopia, Siberia, but he used different names like Tartary. And we can talk about that at another time. But basically, this book, he also talks about the potential of Hebrews or Israelites in the New World. And because this book was immensely popular, and so Yaude Ilan chose that title for this book. It was like a bestseller, and so he chose the title of the book for his community, Mikveh Yisrael. Okay, in 1652, David Nasi, who was an Amsterdam Jew, he also received a patroonship from the Dutch governor, and it's unclear whether he actually settled in Curaçao or whether he just received legal and financial rights to Curaçao. And in any case, both Yao and Nasi, they also spent time in Brazil. And so there was a Jewish community in Brazil from 1634, as I mentioned, until 1654. So there's only 20 years. And so both of these people were spending time in that community and then came to Curaçao. And then there was a third wave, if you will, in 1659, after the Jews of Brazil were kicked out because the Portuguese had taken over Brazil and they didn't allow Jews. So where'd the Jews go? They came to Curaçao. And so a group came in 1659 with Isaac da Costa, and those waves are where we get the Jewish community of Curaçao today, or where it descends from. Okay, so it's interesting. So Curaçao is not the first synagogue in the New World that actually goes to Brazil. And in Recife, Brazil, there was a Jewish synagogue built in 1636, and it was called Kahal Kadosh Tzur Israel, which means the Holy Congregation of the Rock of Israel. And people say that it might be referring to the reefs at Recife, the rocks in the water, the Recife. But in any case, that community ended. The synagogue building is still there in Recife. You can go visit it. But that community ended in 1654. And the Jewish community in Curaçao was started in 1651, as I said. But the first synagogue wasn't built in Curaçao for about 30 years until 1674, when the first synagogue building was dedicated and consecrated. However, at this time, they had already had a Jewish cemetery, which was like the first thing they built. And they dedicated the congregation in 1674. And the synagogue wasn't built until later. Okay, so the first synagogue was built in 1674, but that was a different synagogue than the current one, and the new synagogue was built in 1730, as we'll see. However, in the mid-1800s, the Reform movement was spreading, and so that first synagogue and that first community were Sephardic and Portuguese, or the Sephardic Portuguese Rite, and they were what would be considered Orthodox Jews. Basically, all Jews before the 1800s were essentially Orthodox, and so 1800s brings the Reform movement, and so in 1867 a rival temple, the Reform Temple Emmanuel, was built, and those two, the Orthodox Sephardic and the Reform, were coexisting until the mid 1960s, and they decided to combine in 1964 as the United Netherlands Portuguese Congregation Mikvah Yisrael Emmanuel. So the current Jewish community is Reform, but they meet in the old Sephardic building, the old temple, and they follow the Sephardic rite, but they are Reform and actually Reconstructionist in outlook. So then in 1969, there was a separate group of Ashkenazi, the Chabad movement, and they built Sha'arei Tzedek. Here we have a picture of the Mikvah Yisrael Emmanuel Synagogue. Note the sand on the ground. This is actually somewhat common for places of worship in the Caribbean, and some people say it's to protect the wood, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but there's two big explanations. One of them is that it is when the Inquisition was happening, which never operated in Curaçao, but to protect from the Inquisition, that Portuguese Jews, they put sand on the floor to muffle the sounds of their prayers. There's also another sort of stylistic explanation, which is that the sand represents the 40 years of wandering of the Jews in the desert, the Israelites in the desert. There's also another explanation that the sand represents God's promise to Abraham that he will make their descendants as numerous as the sand on the seashore. In any case, this is the exterior of the old synagogue. The building dates to 1732. Again, the oldest operating synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. And it's in this little town of Curaçao, or the little island of Curaçao. Now, the Portuguese word for synagogue is esnoga, but in the local pronunciation of Papiamento, the G drops out, and so it's affectionately called the Snoa or our Snoa. So from Esnoga to Snoa. Okay, here's the old Jewish cemetery, and there's actually two, but this is the older one. And this is the oldest Jewish cemetery in the Western Hemisphere. It dates from either 1651 or 1659. I'm not exactly sure which. I saw both dates. As you'll see, there's a refinery in the background, and unfortunately that's eroded a lot of the face of the tombstones. And these elaborate tombstones, which have Hebrew writing and depictions, some of them have like skull and crossbones, and all these interesting symbolism, they've all been effaced. And however, some pictures have been taken in some books, and maybe I can link those down below. And essentially, one caveat, back in the 20s, the synagogue, the caskets or the tombstones were like flush with the ground or even beneath the ground, but they decided to raise all the tombstones, and the hope was to protect the tombstones, but that was before the refinery was built, and that had the reverse effect of raising the tombstones to the elements. Here we have the Landhaus Bloemhof, which is a plantation dating back to 1735, owned by a Sephardic family on the island for 13 generations. That's now a art museum and gallery that you can go visit. This shows the importance of the Jewish community in Curaçao. It was founded by two Sephardic Jews, this bank, Maduro and Curiel's Bank, SEL Maduro and Sons, who was one of the wealthiest Jews and businessmen on the island at the time in the late 1800s. And it was a combination of the SEL Maduro company and Curiel, which is a Jewish family on the island and elsewhere that's very well known. And they were so well off that Maduro, he created this house as a wedding gift for his daughter when she was getting married. For his 18-year-old daughter, Deborah Rebecca, for her wedding, he created this, as it's affectionately called, the wedding cake. And in 1917, so this gives you a sense of how wealthy and how special and well off the Jewish community was of Curaçao in the early 1900s. Currently, the building is in use as the state archives. So the wedding cake is in the Charlotte neighborhood, which is an upscale and gentrifying neighborhood, and there's lots of street art that you can go visit. And last, there is the Chocolobo Liquor Company, or the Curaçao Liqueur Company, founded by a Sephardic Jewish family in 1896, a family known as the Seniors. And they use this special blue-orange, it's a blue-colored fruit, and they make the liqueur out of that. And so these are all some great places to check out if you're visiting Curaçao. And I just wanted to give everyone a sense of the rich Jewish heritage of Curaçao. At one time, the Jewish population was between 1,400 and 2,000 people in the mid-1700s. It's declined to about 320, with about 160 active members of the old synagogue. But if you want to find out more, I'll have some links down below. And also, this is a great place to discover more about the Jewish communities and the Jewish history, as well as just history in general of the Caribbean. And I would highly recommend everyone checking it out. Thanks for watching.